Hello, welcome to the last session for today of Investable Nuclear Energy. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Honorable Jeff Merrifield. He's a partner at Pillsbury, but probably you know him better as a former commissioner at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Because of his illustrious background, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff because that's the reason you tuned in. Thank you, Jeff.
Donna, thank you very much, and really appreciate everyone being here today to listen to what I have to say. In terms of my background, just a couple of things that folks may or may not understand. My time in Washington, D.C. Actually goes back to the late 1980s when I came here from New Hampshire, where I grew up, and took a job up on Capitol Hill and actually started out doing energy and nuclear issues, much of it associated with the opening of Seabrook Station Nuclear Power Plant, which was originally supposed to be a 2-unit nuclear power plant, ended up being 1 unit, and was put on in the early 90s. But that took a substantial part of the early time in my career here in Washington. I spent about 10 years on and off on Capitol Hill, became an NRC commissioner in 1998, and did that for 9 years. Moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, took a job with the Shaw Group, where I was responsible for business development in nuclear power plants, and working with that company, which then owned 10% of Westinghouse Corporation. And then 2015, took a partnership at Pillsbury, where I lead the energy practice, and much of my work in the last 7 years has been focused on advanced nuclear. What I want to start off with today as we walk through where we are in this conference is really, and partially because I was a history major in college, I talk a little bit about some of the history where we've come, intermediate stages in that, and then where we are today, and then some of the challenges, many of which were discussed in the last seminar that you may have attended on the workshop, and I thought there were some very good results that came out of that. As you look at the late 80s and 90s, we were really coming out of what I would call a post-Chernobyl stage. There had been a number of changes made to nuclear generation here in the US and elsewhere. We had a US fleet that at that time probably topped up at around 112 reactors, but had low capacity factors, 60s, 70s, and were really struggling. It was a time when there was a lower level of public support. We saw in the early 90s a number of plants that had been planned to be built that ultimately were canceled, in part because of cost overruns, in part because of public opposition. I hearken back to Seabrook Station Nuclear Power Plant in my home state. That plant, although it was completed, the underlying utility, Public Service of New Hampshire, which ultimately came to be owned by Northeast Utilities, had to go into bankruptcy as a result of that whole effort. So it had a very difficult aspect for that region. Similarly, in New York, we went through the Shoreham project, a plant that ultimately was built on the tip of Long Island and did operate and was tested at low power, but never operated at full power because of a decision under then Governor Mayor Cuomo to shut it down. Ultimately, those costs were borne by the ratepayers in Long Island, and even to today, they have among some of the higher costs of energy production resulting from the consequences of that. All of that resulted in, at that time when I was a congressional staffer, a level of support well under 50% for moving forward with nuclear power. Going from that point to the 2000s, and here I'm really sort of referencing the period from 2000 to 2014, you really started to see a real change in the nuclear industry. There was a real effort on the part of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, of which I was a member, to reform its way of doing business. We created at that point a Part 52 process. So moving away from the 2-step licensing process under Part 50, we went to Part 52, which was intended to create a 1-step licensing process, address some of the issues associated with detentions and interventions that had slowed down the progress on a number of plants in the 80s and 90s. And it was hoped move the whole process forward a lot more quickly. We also had the early stages of the license renewal process. This was an opportunity to extend the 40-year licenses for an additional 20 years. That process worked well. And today, virtually every one of the current, almost all of the plants that are currently operating did take advantage of that process. We also had, I think, a period of improving performance by the reactor operators themselves. And there were a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, a lot more care in operations, lessons learned. And so we had a circumstance in which we were in an area where it was very consistent that the industry had 90+% capacity factors, significantly reduced outage times, and really an opportunity to see great value in these plants. At the time, and in sort of the early 2000 timeframe, the price of natural gas was very high. It was well above $8 per million BTU. And so the price of nuclear power, particularly in unregulated markets, looked very positive. A number of power plants were sold, and we had the emergence of Exelon, which became the largest nuclear operator in the US, and they were doing very, very well financially at that time because they were operating in that unregulated market. Some countervailing trends were occurring at that time. Obviously, Yucca Mountain started to get into trouble. We had obviously the concerns raised by the Nevada delegation. They felt they were being, or as Harry Reid would put it, the Screw Nevada legislation. There was a decreasing number of uranium mines in the US. We did not have the highest levels of quality of product, and so that started going down. We had in the 2000 range the shutdown of the Portsmouth and Paducah enrichment facilities, and so the US went from being a country that produced at one point decades ago the 90% of the enriched capability in the world to a point where we weren't really enriching very much at all, a circumstance that really didn't change until Louisiana Enrichment Services built their plant during this time frame as well. Russian sales of uranium became very high. A lot of that at the time thought quite positive. We were taking this Swords to Plowshares program, former Russian weapons, and downblending those in a manner that would allow them to be utilized for fuel. So that was seen as very positive. We saw the emergence of Canada, Kazakhstan, and others taking a lot of that share as well. So at one point, when I was a commissioner, we had a huge amount of support for potentially building the next generation of gigawatt-sized plants. At its peak, we believe we had applications for about 32 units at 17 sites around the country. And the NRC, which had typically been somewhere around 3,000 people, was staffing up to the around 4,000 person range in order to accommodate what was really seen as a bow wave of very large nuclear power plants that was expected to be built in this time frame. Now, as we know, history sort of changed course on that. Most of those were canceled or postponed. We did have the Vogtle and Summer units that did move forward, and today, because of the bankruptcy of SCANA, we now only have just the two units 3 and 4 in Vogtle, which will be completed with AP 1000 units. So a real dramatic shift in what we saw as the prospects for nuclear power at that point. How did this happen? Well, one word: gas, shale gas, in fact, and that was really the driver. Now, there were a lot of factors. The licensing process, the difficulty of getting plants built, those were certainly factors that ran into it. But as we look at what happened in that time frame, utility executives, were faced with a conundrum. They were looking at very low levels of shale gas that were coming out, and they looked at the cost of building nuclear power plants, and putting in a combined cycle using shale gas was financially a much more palatable option for them, which ultimately I think is the reason why an awful lot of these plants ultimately went away. Well, the next phase I would want to talk about is, and this plays into where we are today. It's really the time period from 2015 to the point that we are at right now. As far as the operating fleet is concerned, I think there are sort of two issues here. One, you've got the number of plants which had been, and when I was a commissioner, about 104 operated plants. Today, we've got roughly 93. And they operate now at about a 94% capacity factor, well far above everything else that's operating in the energy fleet. Economic performance is improved, and the utilities have made a real effort to reduce the cost of operation. But particularly in regulated markets, there were significant challenges from a cost standpoint. And as a result, we did have about 10 or so plants which have shut down or are planned to be shut down. Now, I think one of the things is I think there is greater recognition of the value of these units, and a very noteworthy occurrence happened in the context of the last 2 weeks, and that is Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, announcing his view that the shutdown of Diablo Canyon, which had been planned for well over half a dozen years, is something that California is now in the midst of reconsidering. That's a major change. I think it's a good change, and one that was warranted, and one that resulted from a significant amount of significant amount of support coming from members of the nuclear community and others to make that all happen. But I think it does strike the stage of going forward. That leads us to a couple of things. First one is I want to say, obviously, as I mentioned, I've been very involved with the advanced nuclear community. Significant number of plants which are currently being evaluated. We have congressional money that's gone into the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, the selection of both X-Energy and TerraPower to build their first sites, respectively, in Washington State and Wyoming. A series of other risk reduction awards provided to other vendors such as Kairos and Holtec, among others. And then the recent announcements of Ontario Power Generation that they're going to be building GE's BWRX 300 at the Darlington site, combined with a subsequent decision by Jeff Lyash, a friend of mine, that he's going to build one or more of those at the Clinch River site for TVA. Really presages what is going to be, I think, a coming wave of plants going forward. Let me just share a couple of slides here that I think helps frame why is this happening, and why is it perhaps different than where we have been in the past. So I hope folks can see my screen right now. This is really, going to the first slide, this is really a reason why these plants are changing. Let me just put 1 second. Okay, hopefully you can see that full screen at this point. These are some of the utilities and others who made the commitment to go ahead and decarbonize. And one of the things is, you see the note there, they made a pledge to decarbonize 80 to 100%. I've had a number of conversations with U.S. utility executives, and the answer that I'm really hearing these days is we can figure out how to get to 80%. We can use some portion of hydro, renewables, be it wind, solar, we can use batteries, we can use a whole variety of tools. But at the end of the day, we need that 20%, roughly, in some cases 25% of power to be non-intermittent, to be something that we can call on when we need it, and nuclear fits that bill the best in the best manner for us. So that's one of the issues. The second issue is, how do you shape that? And this is interrelated. This picture on the right-hand side shows you the famous Cal-ISO duct curve. This is the timing of when power is needed in California. Now, this is a 2018 slide. Facts haven't really changed. That curve is actually only continuing to go down. And what it shows is, for California, between about 5 o'clock at night till about 9 o'clock at night, you've got a significant ramp up in the amount of power that's needed, because people are turning on their air conditioners and they're coming home and they're opening the refrigerators and whatnot. And so having the ability to meet that right now is difficult from a non-carbon standpoint. Really, what's happening is you get a lot of combustion turbines, either peakers or combined cycles, that are filling that need. And so while we're driving a lot of excess capacity in the middle part of the day, about 2 o'clock, from all rooftop solar and others in California, you've really got that demand curve that's in the wrong place. Now, advanced reactors really fit into this. You've talked in other parts of this about many of the specific and positive aspects. I'm not going to repeat those. Those are listed on the left. But I would say, as you've sort of heard about TerraPower, for example, their Natrium reactor is intended to be operating at a 345 megawatt level 24/7, but they can take some of that power, put it in a molten salt solar storage, and really have about 5 hours of peak performance at about 500 megawatts. So that's something which can very much take advantage of this, as can the ability of these advanced non-light water reactors to actually shape their curve through ramping up and ramping down. The final issue I think that I would want to just sort of lay out here is the cost issue. You know, a lot of accusations are made about how costly nuclear power is and how cheap wind and solar are in comparison. And I think that fails to recognize there's a bit of a apples and oranges comparison. With nuclear power plants that we've been talking about, when you have whether it's a 1,000 megawatt unit or a 300 megawatt unit, you have the ability to have an 80-year lifetime. You've got 24/7 power, and you're online 95% of the time. In comparison, wind and solar capacity factors roughly together about 40%, which means about 60% of the time you're going to have that backup. That backup is either going to be natural gas, or if you can get sufficient bulk storage, and that's going to be difficult to do with batteries given the demand for batteries, particularly in electrification of vehicles. And frankly, it's difficult given the lifetime of some of those units, which are at best 8 to 10 years. So when you make that comparison, and then you also account for the fact that wind and solar units both have a lifetime of 20, maybe 25 years if you can, you're making a comparison of the cost of building a single nuclear unit versus the cost of building equivalent generation plus backup, plus doing it at least 4 or 5 times. So that's a big difference. And so this is a slide that I've been using with public utility commissioners, and they certainly have sort of come to appreciate the importance of this. Okay, so bringing us back to sort of some of the things that we talked about earlier this afternoon, I would say there's a lot of attention that's been given to mining, and I thought there was a great report out about geographically a lot of things are tied together. The issues in Ukraine, Russia, and elsewhere really bringing this to the fore. How do we move forward on this? And I think there's a couple of things that are going to happen. One, the U.S. uranium mining industry is obviously working very hard to convince Congress to take more action to provide them some support. That may be through a uranium bank, there may be other financial support mechanisms. One of the challenges I think we have in all of that is that as a country, some of our most valuable uranium resources are behind us. The quality of many of the uranium reserves in the United States don't match up against others that are in the market. And unfortunately, there's an excellent source of uranium in Virginia that could have been very valuable that the state of Virginia has essentially taken off the shelf. And while many of us were trying to convince the U.S. Supreme Court to go otherwise, they upheld the ability of the state to withhold those assets. So that's an unfortunate one from our energy independence standpoint. But I do think we need to think from North American perspective and from the perspective of our allies. Can't forget Canada. Canada is the second largest supplier of uranium in the world after Kazakhstan. Their resources in Saskatchewan are not only enormous, but also incredibly valuable, of very high concentration. And so I think these events are actually going to increase the interest and focus on those mines. I will note there was actually even announced today a transaction where some shares of a mine up in Saskatchewan have been traded. I think you're going to see a lot more activity in that area. Australia has enormous uranium assets. No one questions the relationship we have with that country. I think that will be another one we will see. There was also some comments about uranium is a good neighbor. How do we convince people about that? I think there's issues on both sides of that. Historically, and I think the NRC has grappled with this with some of the recent public meetings, there are 15,000 abandoned sites where various mining was undertaken. Many of those on the lands of Native Americans. The Navajos particularly have a lot of that. So there is some baggage that we face. The second thing I think is that many of the mines more recently, and I think going forward, have been in situ leach mining. I think we're going to see more of that, and that is from an environmental standpoint significantly less impactful. HALEU was an issue that came up. This, for the advanced reactor community, many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, HALEU is a significant issue. We don't, previously I had clients that were really looking to Russia as the source for that, at least initially. Congress certainly has attention to that issue, and I suspect there will be significant resources that will continue to come out of Congress. There is also expectation on Congress's part that DOE will act to try to provide some incentives to get that HALEU build out. Where that goes exactly, it's uncertain. Again, as in the case of uranium in general, HALEU bank may be something that Congress comes up with. The market signals, I think, are getting increasingly closer. Centrus has the ability to produce that material. They have a centrifuge design. They did have money from DOE to introduce those in Portsmouth, Ohio. How that moves forward, I think, we'll see that play out over the next year. And then both Centrus and Orono have the capability to produce HALEU. The facility owned by Urenco in New Mexico does have the ability to go into those operations if they choose. Right now, I think it's an economic decision. Is there sufficient recognition in the market that it's worth it for these companies to move forward? I think we're going to see those signals probably move out within the next 6 months to a year. Finally, I think some things that we ought to think about a little bit on that score is, as a country, we don't produce that material either for the military or for the civilian world. The Navy right now, which depends entirely on highly enriched fuel for its submarines and carriers, has sufficient supplies, probably to take it through the 2030s into maybe the early 2040s. But that's a limited lifetime. They ultimately will need some of that material, and that material will need to be produced by an American company. Can't be produced by others because of treaty obligations. So I do think there will be an impetus on the part of Congress to try to fill that void. I would also note a lot of the plans for space reactors, for mobile reactors, may not have sufficient HALEU available to them either. Other issues, I think, as we look at these fields going forward, and I would say this, I think this is a very positive time for the industry. I was at a USNIC conference just recently, extraordinary amount of support, and I think really, in some cases, more than we've seen in a long, long time. The use of these reactors for heat and for industrial purposes is quite noteworthy. In the earlier timeframes that I talked about, all we really worried about were utilities producing power. That's not the case today. Those will be some of the principal purchasers, and at least initially, but I think there's a whole market out there for mining companies, for chemical companies, petrochemical, other uses. And I know I've heard others talk about potentially using on civilian ships. All of these are potential markets down the line, which do not necessarily rely on the same group of users, principal utilities we have today. Microreactors, that program under the PALE program under the Department of Energy is moving forward. I think that really is transformative, not only for the purpose of reducing the need for liquids in foreign combat environments, but also the potential down the line to use microreactors for laser weapons and others that will be needed to battle the hypersonic missiles that are being developed and produced by our opponents in Russia and China. Space is going to be exciting, a lot of different applications, and I'm certain there's been some very good seminars there. Finally, I would want to say, hanging above all of this is there was some discussion about this earlier, the issue of regulations. The NRC right now is working on, and they had a public meeting today on Part 53, the congressionally required development of a new set of standards for these reactors to enable the ability to deploy these reactors. That's going to be a real challenge. A lot of hard work. I know the NRC is working hard on it. A lot to be done, and I think a number of folks in the industry have different views about how successful that's going to be. I cross my fingers. I hope it will be successful, and we'll see where it goes. So, final comment, and then I've chewed up most of the time, but certainly happy to take a few questions. This isn't just a U.S. thing. Huge support we see building in Europe, particularly with what's going on in Ukraine. Africa is looking very strongly at the potential of deploying some of these advanced reactor and light water reactor SMR technologies. So I think there's an incredible promise out there for individuals who'd like to get in this field, and happy to engage with all of you going forward. With that, looking at the chat, I don't see any questions right now. If folks have any,
We do have one in the Q&A box.
oh, in the Q&A. Okay,
Cross.
great.
He's asking, and I think you actually answered part of this, what do you see are the primary issues associated with nuclear-driven integrated hybrid energy systems, which takes nuclear beyond electricity production?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. There's a couple of things that I would answer there. One of them is regulations do have something to do with it. The NRC doesn't have a lot of experience with regulating reactors in an environment where you have other hazards, whether it's the production of hydrogen, whether it's being near chemical facilities. Now, there are examples where that has occurred. I would note the Riverbend nuclear power plant in Louisiana is not connected to, but very in close proximity to a chemical production facility. So that the NRC has had to consider those things before. I think one of the benefits of advanced reactor technology is because of their reduced source term and the designs of those reactors, you really can conceptualize those types of uses because you don't have the ability to spread the material in the same way as you could potentially with a large light water reactor as we currently have. So I think I hear of lots of very creative potential uses for these technologies, and I think that's going to continue.
Okay, I don't see anything else in the queue. So I think with that, we'll be wrapping up right on time. Jeff, I really can't thank you enough for stepping in and helping us out here. I think your remarks are very well taken and a very nice wrap up for today. For the audience, tomorrow we will be moving on to think about how we start packaging this message, whether it's going out to the public, to students, or to investors. How do we pull all of the stuff that we've learned this week together and put it into a package that allows us to move forward past some of these public perception issues that are holding the industry back? Jeff, thank you so much.
Donna, thank you. Appreciate you inviting me.